Morning everyone, my name's Chris. I'm one of the equity consultants at Vested, and welcome to how to design kickass equity agreements. It's not my favourite title, as Matt alluded to, but yeah, so today we're just going to sort of go through a few things. So we'll cover some pitfalls that we should avoid, customising of schemes, set conditions, and we'll go over a little bit about equity, as it were. So Vested, we're the UK's first regulated digital share scheme and equity management platform. We're an end-to-end equity solution platform, and all we deal with is equity. We don't do anything else. So we like to think of ourselves as subject matter experts. So we'll talk about the rise of share schemes. There's now over 16,000 share schemes registered in the UK. It's a record high. You know, people do share schemes for three main reasons: to recruit, to retain, to reward. So, you know, for recruitment costs are high. Sometimes, you know, these days in the digital age, you know, you're not competing against local people anymore, you're competing against everyone. So equity as a recruitment tool is fantastic. Equity as a retention tool, because once you've got those good people, you want to keep a hold of them. So the retention is key as well. And then to reward them, you know, for all their hard work. So we'll look at some common pitfalls. So when you think of shares, you often think of just common shares. You know, no strings attached. It's just here's a share in my business. But, you know, the risk to that is, what if they don't deliver? What if they, you know, let's say I joined the company today and they gave me 10% of the business. Fantastic. If I walk away tomorrow, I still own 10% of the business. So, you know, you've got to protect yourself, to make sure that you're not giving them, you know, this is equity. This is part of your business. So you want to protect yourself. So you don't share it with no conditions, you share it with conditionality. So protecting the business, but rewarding those who do make the difference, those key people that come in and drive the business forward. So we'll talk about sort of different custom types of share schemes that we can do. Oh, so where are we going? There we go. Instead of issuing shares, you can give options. Now, options is the right to buy a share at a predetermined price, at a predetermined point in the future. Now, that point in the future could be 5 years down the line, or it could be it only happens when we exit the business. It could be when the business is valued at £5 million or £10 million, or, you know, you can build lots of different conditions into that. You know, performance-based, time-based. You can also set options to vest over a full period of time. So in this example, there's a 1 year cliff. So this is a 4-year scheme. So for the first 12 months, you don't get anything. The options are only going to vest once you get past the first 12 months. Call it a probation period. Then you can see in year 2, they start to gain them. So get 25%. You know, after the full 4 years, they've got 100% of the options that you've given out. Let's say after 4 years here, they fully vested. That still doesn't mean they have the right to become a shareholder, because that we hark back to the conditions at that point. They vested over a 4-year period, but if they only benefit on an exit, nothing happens till an exit. If they only benefit when the business is valued at £5 million. So, but they have earned those options over that period of time. But you're still protecting yourself, because after 4 years, if it's you know, they can only exit when the business, they can only exercise them when the business is worth £5 million. If after 4 years the business is still worth £2 million, they don't have the right to become a shareholder at that point. It's only when the conditions have been met. Not all options are the same. You know, one of the most popular things we see is the EMI scheme. The EMI scheme is the British government approved share scheme. It's the most tax efficient thing you can do in the UK. So it benefits the individuals in that they will only pay 10% capital gains tax as long as they met the conditions and they held the options for a minimum of 24 months. It benefits the company because the company can offset what the individual gains, but the company can also offset the cost of setting up and running the scheme. So it is a tax offsettable scheme. So it's incredibly tax efficient. So it's the most popular thing we do on the platform, but you know, obviously, we've got Theo in Greece. that wouldn't be effective there because it's a UK tax scheme. So you have to be a full-time UK-based employee. It has to be a UK topco that's done over. So there's lots of different conditionality and eligibility criteria in it, but as I say, incredibly tax efficient. You've got unapproved options. This does not seem to want to scroll down. There we go. So unapproved options. The difference between unapproved options and approved options are they don't have the eligibility criteria. So you can give unapproved options to anyone. They don't need to be an employee. They don't need to be in this country. You know, unapproved options can be popular, for example, for advisory boards, for contractors. You know, it's a very efficient way to do it. It's not as tax efficient. So you see here in the UK, the net to the recipient, they'd only be walking away with £4.95. Whereas on the same grant for the EMI, they're walking away with £8.10. So as I say, it's not as tax efficient, but you know, it's still a way to share equity. So that's some example of the different types of things. So are there any questions about that?
Yeah, Chris, so a couple that have already come in, just based on, you mentioned it very briefly there, but and maybe something that you continue to sort of touch on as we go through, but we've had a question about international issues with share equity. You mentioned there the difference between the two schemes, perhaps.
Yeah, so EMI is a British government approved option scheme. So obviously, if you're not inside the UK, the British government aren't going to tax it. So you know it's going to be there. So you would look at either unapproved options, in which case the recipients will face their local tax consequence, or you could also look at growth shares. And growth shares are different from options in that they are real shares. So I mean, I'll quickly touch on to the growth shares in a second. That's a slightly different. Slide deck. So growth shares are very different in that growth shares are real shares, but they're issued above the current value of the company. Oh, so that's not changed yet. Let me stop that again, try that one more time. Cool. There we go, apologies for that. So growth shares are real shares, but they're issued above the value of the company. So one of the fundamentals about equity is you cannot give someone something of value without there being a tax consequence. So let's say we value your business at £1 million and you gave me 10% of it. Thank you very much. Day one, I get a bit of paper that says you've given me 10% of the company. Day two, I get a £45,000 tax bill from HMRC. Because according to them, you've just given me 100 grand's worth of shares, 10% of £1 million, and I pay my marginal rate of tax, my income tax on that. So that's up to 45%. So, you know, to recruit and to motivate people, that's not something you typically want to do. So what you do is you issue some growth shares. So if we valued that same company at £1 million, you would issue it above that value. So if you use this example, Stephanie and Ted have grown a business to £1 million. So we'll call it 1 million shares, we'll say £1 a share. So Jim joining the business, but they want to issue Jim with some equity. So what they do is they put a little bit, what we call a hurdle on it, 20%, that 20 pence there, to ensure there is a difference between what the company is valued at and what they issue at. So they issue Jim with the growth shares at £1.20 and above, which means that the growth shares are worthless when they're issued. So there's no tax to pay. But what that means is Jim's only going to share above that £1.20. So from fast forward, Jim's done a very good job. The business is now valued at £10 a share. But Stephanie and Ted, the first £1.20 a share is still theirs. They're only sharing in the growth of the business. So they dilute above £1.20. Jim only shares above £1.20. So what that means is he's done a very good job of growing the business. So it's now worth £10, and they think, we're going to need to bring more people in. So Sarah comes in. Again, the business is valued at £10, so you put a 20% hurdle on that. And Sarah is issued with growth shares above £12. So Stephanie and Ted are diluting further, but only in the growth. So Stephanie and Ted, if we say 10% for ease of maths, Stephanie and Ted own 100% of the business up to £1.20. They own 90% of the business between £1.20 and £12. They own 80% of the business above £12. So yes, they are diluting, but only in the growth. So whatever happens, the first 1.2 million, £1.20 a share is always Stephanie and Ted. So it's a really good way to motivate growth. We often see it, senior leadership teams, business development, their whole purpose is to grow the business. But anything that can grow the business, growth shares are fantastic. And growth shares have no restrictions. So again, the EMI eligibility restrictions, growth shares don't have them. So you can issue them in Greece, issue them anywhere you want, issue them all over the world. The only sort of restrictions to things like that is they face a lot of times it's what's the local tax consequence, but key thing is if you're issuing in America, you have to do a fair market valuation. Or if you're issuing options in America, you've got to do a 409A valuation, which is, it's an additional cost that has to be done every year. So much like HMRC in the UK has reporting procedures, there's different reporting procedures in America. So that's a quick thing about growth shares. There's no offset against corporation tax, but 20% capital gains tax. So what that means is it falls between the EMI and unapproved options in the tax efficiency scale.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Chris. There was a question that came in. I think you've answered already. Then the question was, if we issue growth shares, can we issue more later for existing/new employees? So you talk through two examples there. One where you've issued it straight away for somebody, and then at a later date, once the business has grown, what you're doing is you're setting a new hurdle price for that new person, because the business is now at a higher value. And again, it needs to be out of the money. It needs to have zero value when you're issuing those shares to that person.
Yeah, so we do the valuation for you, and then you would add the hurdle to it to ensure that it's issued in a worthless state. Because if it's not in a worthless state, then it immediately creates a tax consequence.
Yeah, well, a couple of interesting ones coming in just off the back of the different options that are being mentioned. So somebody's got, what do they say? So all participants are currently contractors, some UK and some overseas. So given what you've said, unapproved options would be relevant, and potentially growth shares in this. So if they want to add employees in the future, they're saying, do they do two schemes?
Yes. Now, let's use Vested as an example. We're a fully remote organisation. So I'm in the UK, Matt's in the UK, but we have colleagues outside of the UK. So we issue both EMI, I've got EMI, Matt's got EMI, and we also issue unapproved options. Now, we have, myself and my colleagues outside the UK have exactly the same conditions. They're both option schemes. We both have the same exercise prices and conditions and things like that. Now, the only difference is the tax consequence. So I get the EMI tax consequence, and they will face their local tax consequence. So it's a very fair way to do it, because it means we've got the exact same conditions. It's the same legal contract. It's just different tax consequences upon exercise.
Yeah.
So, or we often see a mix and a match. It's very much horses for courses. So, we often see EMI for the UK, unapproved options for those outside the UK, and perhaps growth shares for the new business development director that's just come in. His, whole drive is to grow the business. So we often see a mix and match. It's not a thing. And, let's say we've got 5 EMI, 5 unapproved options, and 2 growth shares today. Next year, we're issuing another tranche to new employees. So we add another 5 growth shares, another 3 EMI, and 7 more unapproved options. It's just a new valuation. But you'd have to do that anyway, because to do EMI, you have to get an HMRC approved valuation. And for unapproved options, you need to set the strike price. And for growth shares, you need to set the hurdle. So you need the valuation anyway. So, often we'll see people will say, right, 1st of January is when we issue options and or growth shares. So if you join in January, you get them. If you join after that, you wait till the next January to get them. But then you could adjust the vesting period. So if I joined in December and received options straight away, I've got a 4-year vesting period before they're fully vested. But if I joined in February, I would have a 3-year, 2-month vesting period because my 8 months would already be taken into account. So a wide variety of ways that you can do it. But yeah, I mean, mixing and matching and adding people, it's all very easy to do. It's all, the vested platform is essentially a one-stop shop for the design, the execution, and crucially, the ongoing management of share and equity schemes.
Yeah, well, thanks, Chris. As a really good good question coming in. So can the type of shares that you're issuing in, so say an EMI scheme, be different class of shares to the existing ordinary shares held by the owner?
Yes, it's very common. It's a question we ask is, what's the plan? So, we've got 2 integration companies house, so we set up new share classes for clients all the time. It's a few clicks of a button with us, to be perfectly honest with you, and then the platform does all the company's house filings. But is it necessary? So, for example, I was speaking to someone last week who is going to do an EMI scheme, and I said, "Yeah, we'll need a new share class to issue the EMI in." Yeah, fantastic, can do that, no problem at all. However, they're going to do an exit only scheme. So the recipients are only going to benefit upon an exit. So you don't need a new share class because they're only going to become a shareholder for a nanosecond as the transaction goes through. If it's an exercisable option scheme and they're going to become shareholders and remain shareholders for a period of time, then yeah, having a separate share class can be beneficial because you can differentiate between, do they have the right to vote? Do they have the right to dividend? And if you've got different share classes, you can obviously pay differential dividends. But, everything's included with us. So we're not going to just try and do extra stuff to generate more. It's all included. So we'll sort of sit down with you and say, what are you looking to do? Brilliant. It's an exit-based scheme. We don't really need a separate share class. I mean, if you really want to, we can set one up for you, but it's never going to come into fruition apart from a nanosecond at the back end. But yeah, certainly if it's an exercisable scheme and they're going to become full shareholders from an option, then yes, it's a separate share class. We can do that for you, no problem. Growth shares are already a separate share class because they only share in the growth.
Yeah. There's a few questions coming in, Chris, that are related to things like if I'll sort of go through the 2 that I'm sort of thinking of at the moment, but maybe we leave these to later. So what happens when growth shares if an employee chooses to leave? And the other one is around growth shares and can you set a vesting period? So I think if we were going to go through the conditionality, maybe we sort of just touch on that part of saying how growth shares sort of reverse vest effect, and then how that works just as an overview, and then we can perhaps go into the conditionality, because I think there's plenty that you'll touch on in the next part, but we can then revisit the questions, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, just really quickly, what happens to growth shares if the person leaves? It's entirely up to you how you want to set it up. What's most common? If you leave, you lose. The part of the conditions are you have these growth shares conditionally until either we exit the business or you leave the company. If you leave the company, the shares are deferred and cancelled. You can set it up so that if you leave the company, you get to keep them. But, you know, if you did that and I left the next day, then I keep my growth shares. So, you know, or you put the vesting conditions on. So you could say, Chris, I'm going to issue these growth shares conditionally. So you can have 10% of the company above £1.20 a share on the conditions that you're still here in 5 years' time. So those growth shares are conditional for 5 years. After 5 years, they become unconditional, and I am a shareholder. So if I leave the business at that point, it comes down to what your shareholders agreement says. Or it could say, Chris, you're going to come in, you're going to drive the business. If you bring in £1 million worth of business in the next 12 months, I'll give you 10,000 growth shares. You bring in 750 grand to $1 million, I'll give you 7,500. You bring in between 500 grand and 750, you get 5,000. You bring in less than that, you get nothing. So it's reverse vesting. So what that means is I get the full amount up front. So I am issued with 10,000 conditional growth shares right now. Fast forward a year, obviously I've smashed that £1 million target, no problem at all. So those 10,000 growth shares become unconditional. Or I've had a bit of a hard time, I've only brought in 800 grand. So of my 10,000 that I had been granted conditionally, 2,500 are deferred and cancelled, and the other 7,500 become unconditional because that was the conditions that we set. Or I've had an absolute mare, I've sold nothing, I've not broached that 500 grand. My 10,000 growth shares that I was granted a year ago, all 10,000 are deferred and cancelled. So you can set the conditions that you like. And it's the same with options. You can set conditions over options. Matt will pop a link into the chat, something called 26 conditional KPIs. It's common conditions that we see in option and share schemes. So, but yeah, that's sort of how the conditionality works around the growth share.
Brilliant. I think if we go on to the second part then, Chris, and then I'll revisit some of these other questions and begin.
Yeah, so the very best conditional equity milestones. Conditions should be specific, tangible, and measurable. Now, the reason for that is so that you can't argue about it. You know, it's to protect the business, but also to protect the recipient. You know, if we say, Chris, after 5 years, you get these options become exercisable. Can't really argue with that. If you say, Chris, after the company becomes fully viable, then your options become exercisable. We can argue about that. So, you know, having them specific, tangible, and measurable and mutually agreed. You know, as I say, it's definitely well worth having a look at the equity guide. You know, so here's just some specific examples. Be part of the team over a certain period of time, work for 5 days a month. You know, we talked at the X in sales. Now, we say it can be tiered here, but often it's great if it is. Because if we think back to that example I just gave, Chris, we get 10,000 growth shares, you bring in over £1 million worth of business. If that's the only condition, if I bring in £999,999.99, I get nothing. So having that little bit of a tiering tends to be a little bit fairer. Or deliver a project. And that's, you know, delivering a project, that's where you would have growth shares to a contractor. Matt, if you build me an all singing, all dancing e-commerce website in the next 8 months, you get this. Matt does what he's told, does what he's delivers on the agreed project, he gets this. Matt does not deliver on the agreed project, he doesn't get it. You know, business sold for X, or, you know, you can give it to referrers, influencers. If you refer 15 people to the vested platform over the next 12 months, we will give you this. You know, it's all very, very specific and measurable, and it's a contract. So a little bit about conditionality, if there's any questions about that.
Yep, plenty coming through. So, and particularly around, also around growth shares as well. So, is there a best practice for offering share options to an advisory board?
Now, advisory board, typically not a full-time UK-based employee. So EMI, pretty much immediately. Non-exec directors, the same. So you're looking at either growth shares or you're looking at unapproved options. There's no easy way. Every business is individual. You know, are they there to drive growth? Yes, growth shares, fantastic. Is it, you know, if you refer people to me, you know, we can give you options. It depends how you want to set it up. There's multiple ways to do it. Typically, growth shares are more tax efficient. The number that you're giving, you know, I always say start at the back end and work your way forward. If you're going to sell your business for £10 million and you've given someone 1%, they're going to walk away with 100 grand at the back end. Is that fair? Is that equitable? And that's pre-tax. So if it's growth shares, they'll walk away with 80 grand. If it's unapproved options, 450. You know, is that fair? Is that equitable? Is that provided a value to you? Also, is that motivating? You know, let's say it's to retain, to recruit, and to reward. Is that going to help you recruit? Is that going to help you retain? Is that a suitable reward for them? You know, it's not something we can answer for you. It's how important are they? How key are they? You know, there's a great book called Slicing the Pie, which talks about, you know, putting a monetary value on a role and then slicing the equity pie to reward that. It's definitely well worth a read. There's even a chapter on how to use vested to slice that pie. But yeah, I mean, that's worth looking at.
Well, just on that, so you've mentioned on how you link share options with performance milestones. And I think the key one there, Chris, is probably, and the same for, you know, you mentioned there about advisory boards. It's trying to keep it simple, isn't it? Really, so it's fair and measurable, really.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key things that we talk about when we talk to people is the most common question that I'm asked, certainly, I think you as well, Matt, is how much equity should I give?
Yeah.
So, you know, if you're talking about, you know, how much should I give the advisory board? How much equity should I give overall? And again, we say start at the back, start at the end, and work your way backwards. How much of the business are you would you be willing to give away overall? You know, if you say, well, I'm only ever going to give away 10% of my business. I don't want to give away any more else. Right, so who are you going to give it to? Your advisory board. You've got 3 early key members of staff. So are you going to give the full 10% to them? So if you're giving the full 10% to those 4 people, what about moving forward? What about any other key employees you need to bring on board? What about, you know, if you give the full 10% straight away, it's gone. So, you know, it's about making sure that you've got that pool managed. You know, save some for those later. You know, what happens if you need to hire a really key member of staff to get you to that exit or to whatever your goal is? You want to have something to be able to offer.
Yeah, there's a great question. There's just come in saying, do shares issued, so whether that's growth shares or the options that are issued, do they affect control over the business?
Not if you don't want them to. So, you know, growth shares are shares, but they're a separate share class. So one of the first things we would ask you when setting up that share class is, do you want them to have the right to vote? Options have no right to vote until they exercise. So as I said earlier on, if it's an exit-based scheme, doesn't matter what share class they're in because they only hold it for a nanosecond. You don't get to vote, you don't get to do anything. If it's an exercisable scheme, then once they exercise, dilution occurs. So if Matt and I own 50% of the business each and we gave yourselves 10%. Once the option gets to that point, we say it's 5 years vesting. After that, you get the right to become a shareholder. So after 5 years, you become a shareholder. Matt and I at that point would dilute. So we would go from 50-50 to 45-45 as you come in as the new 10% shareholder. Now, does that affect the voting rights? Only if we've given you in a share class that has the right to vote. Now, Companies Act of 2006, which deals with all the companies in the UK, requires a 75% threshold to pass a written shareholder resolution. So while Matt and I are 50-50, we both have to pass that for it to pass. We've given you 10%, we've dropped to 45-45, which essentially means your 10% doesn't make a huge difference because it's still Matt and I that decide, no one else can. But it means that I have the right to be informed and told about it, and I have the right to vote, even if it doesn't affect the overall outcome. Now, obviously, if you're taking on investment, you're diluting that way. And then if you gave 10%, that might drop you below that 75%. So let's say I've got 80% of the business, 20% investors. I give Matt 10%. And I would drop from when Matt came in, everyone dilutes equally. So as Matt becomes a shareholder, I would drop from 80% to 72%. And the investors would drop from 20% to 18% to cover that 10% that Matt's just come in. Now, what that means is that takes me below the 75% threshold, which means I no longer have full control of the written shareholder resolutions. But if Matt came in with his 10% and he was in a non-voting share class, then yes, I dilute to 72% of capital distribution when the business sells, but I still maintain my 80% of the voting rights, which means I'm still in full control of the written shareholder resolution. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important point, isn't it, Chris? And I think it goes back to your sort of your original description, which is all about what is it you're trying to achieve and how much do you want to give up? And we've had a couple of questions there which are about, I suppose, the difference between growth shares, which are real shares issued up front but with conditionality, and they can be voting or non-voting, but also going back to the question of, can you set up a different share class to put options over? And again, you're choosing what you want that share class to be, whether that's voting rights, rights to dividends, and rights to capital. And then the third part is whether that's exercisable or it's just exercisable upon exit. So there's lots of factors, and I suppose the great part is there's huge amounts of flexibility to mean that it can be tailored towards whatever the business goal is and the drive of the individual and for the business owner as well. Just, yeah.
It's important to remember the purpose, which is to recruit, retain, reward. So if you say, Chris, I want you to set up a new share class for me, it's not going to have the right to dividend, it's not going to have the right to vote. And you know what? We'll make it exercisable because I'm not going to sell the business, I'm going to keep the business. What's the motivator? They're not going to get any dividends, they're not going to get any votes, and you're not going to sell the business, so they're not going to get anything from that. So it's important to think about, what is the overarching goal? It's the question I ask, almost immediately when I'm talking to someone. What are you looking to achieve? So it's just about how we understand that then informs how we can sort of lay out different options for you. But everyone can just book straight into my diary and we can go through things on an individual basis if that helps.
Yeah, no, really good. And just going back to the growth shares, Chris, just to revisit some of those things that we mentioned before. So somebody had asked about the use of growth shares and can you set the vesting period, which you mentioned, yes, you can. You set down the conditionality and how long you want that to be over. So you're setting that out. But they did ask us sort of a follow-up, which is about the tax point. So if they were to, there's conditionality over 3 years, for example, is the taxable value 0 when the shares are awarded? Or is it at the end of the 3 years? So it's probably worth touching on the tax points within growth shares.
Yeah, so growth shares are real shares. So even if So you issue them, it's reverse vesting. So if we go back to the example where I'm given 10,000 if I hit £1 million, I'm given 10,000 growth shares. I'm on the cap table as holding 10,000 growth shares, even though they are still conditional. Now, they're issued to me at the hurdle. So we'll call the hurdle £1.20. And let's say I've got to hit £5 million over a 5-year period. So I hit my goal. I bring in £5 million over a 5-year period. So the company value is now up here. The shares were issued here. So I'm sharing in the growth above this £1.20, even though it's now worth £12. So I get my percentage in that. So 20% capital gains tax if I sell them. Once they become unconditional, we're then talking the same thing. Do I have the right to dividend? Do I have the right to vote? And that's why it's important to understand, is it an exit-based scheme or is it exit? Do you intend to exit the business in the next 5 years?
Yeah. I think that's, interesting as well, isn't it, with growth shares, is that because the valuation is done so that they are out of the money, they have no value at the point in which they're issued. There's no tax to pay at that point, and there's no tax when they become unconditional. It's only on the exit, as you've said, which is great. And we talked about when somebody leaves, what happens. But related to that, I suppose, there's the conditionality element. We did have a question, do vested assist with drafting of shareholders agreements? But I think, important to sort of say what vested does help with, and that might be your other couple of slides really, and the bits that we don't, but we can maybe, if we don't support it, then we have people we can introduce you to. But I would say what people are looking for here is really covered within the platform.
Yeah, so we're not a law firm, so we won't, if you're doing option agreements, we have the contract template. So we have a scheme designer, which has got 23 questions, and each one will auto-populate the legal contract. We have document templates available to our clients. So if you needed to do a shareholders agreement, we have a template shareholders agreement. But as we're not a law firm, so we won't bespoke it for you. But when you're issuing conditional equity, we have that fully covered. It's just we wouldn't draft a legal document for you, as I say, because we're not a law firm.
No.
We are the UK's original share scheme platform. So we are an FCA accredited business. We're the only FCA accredited business that do this. We're the only ones that have two-way integration with company SIPs. So, all your full cap table management, scenario modeling, issuing shares. So people often join us just before a raise. So if you're taking on investment, you can use the vested platform to issue the shares. We're a digital platform. We do everything digitally. So it's emails. We took on investment ourselves last summer. The money hit the bank at 10 o'clock in the morning. By 10:15, all of our new shareholders had their digital share certificates and also a login to the system so they can see what they have. The traditional way to do it, you go to accountants and lawyers, there's setup fees, there's ad hoc fees for doing things, HMRC submissions, you're in spreadsheet hell. You've got all the compliance risk. If you're doing EMI, you've got the additional reporting at the back end. With the vested platform, the platform does all the filings. You use our contracts and paperwork. There's no spreadsheets. The compliance risk is managed by the fact that the platform will write the HMRC submissions for you and will automatically file things with companies' house. So it's just a nice, simple way to do it. The whole purpose of Vest is to make this simple and also available to everyone, because the old traditional way was the price quickly rises when you're talking to accountants and lawyers every day. So we are subject matter experts. This is all we do. So it's a nice and simple way to do it. I mentioned earlier on, there's free consultations. That's not a problem whatsoever. You can book directly into my diary. So we'll get an email out to everyone, hopefully tomorrow, which will have this recording on. There's also a link to my diary if you want to book in, or go into the Vested website just now and book in, or Matt could probably drop a link to my diary into into the
Yeah.
chat as well.
I'll do that now. We'll also, one of the things, so we've had a request for is a link to slicing pie. So we'll perhaps include that in the email, Chris. I think so everybody can see that as well. Just going back, one of the things you touched on there. So I suppose a couple of parts is, obviously why Vested was set up. Trying to help reduce cost and complexity around each of these areas. So one of the things you mentioned there that's included in this is valuation. Traditionally, people would have gone to their accountant. Just to say, we work with lots of accountants still. They do come to us either for themselves or also for their clients, and we work very closely with them. And you can invite accountants, lawyers in to use and be editors within the platform for your company as well, which often helps. But within that valuation, just to sort of go back to one of the questions that was asked, Chris. So they've asked, how do we value the shares? And I suppose that's different if we're looking at options, if we're looking at growth shares, and the types of valuations that we really do.
Yeah. So what's key is the valuations we do are share scheme valuation. Traditionally, we're looking at getting the lowest possible valuation we can, because we're looking to set the tax point. Now, it's not a publicly disclosed figure, it's never going to affect a raise or anything like that, but essentially we are saying this is the lowest we can get you to. Now, if you're doing an option scheme, you can also discount certain things. So if you've had EIS or SEIS, you can discount that because it's not full risk investment. If you've had any family and friends invest, you can discount that because it's not at arm's length. If you're given less than 15% shareholding to an individual, you can discount that because it's a minority shareholder. But we're also not building in hope premiums, future order values. We're looking for the lowest possible. It's a snapshot of your tax point at a certain period of time. So if you're doing an EMI valuation, as an example, that is only valid for 90 days. That's an HMRC rule. So it used to be it was 120 days during COVID, and last December they dropped it back down to 90 days, which it was pre-COVID. So you've got that snapshot. So you have that. This is what I can issue at this. You don't have to issue it at that low value. All we are saying is if you issue here or above, there's no tax implication for the recipient. If you issue below here, there is tax implication for the recipient. So let's say the company's valued at £1 a share, but I get issued my options at 0. That means that when I exercise that option, I'm being gifted £1. So I'm going to pay my marginal rate of tax on £1, which is going to be 45p. So if you're only giving me one, I'm only paying 45p. That's not a problem. If you're giving me 100,000 shares and I'm paying 45p on every one of those £100,000, that's an issue. So, wow. Unfortunately, it's an issue for me. I wish it wasn't, but that would be an issue for me. So it's about understanding where the tax point is and how you want to do it. But again, that's something we can talk over. And again, with the growth shares, when I say the 20% hurdle, that's just common. It doesn't have to be there. It has to be at least there, otherwise there'll be a tax implication. But I've dealt with businesses that have said, right, Chris, we're only valued at £2 million, but our plan is in 8 years' time we're going to sell for 20 million. So the two co-founders set up a growth share scheme, which meant they got the first 10 million. So they're only sharing above £10 million, but they were being very generous with their staff above £10 million. And their staff, knowing they're being very generous, because I went to a team meeting and told them all about it, they know if they get that value of that business above £10 million, they are in for a lot of money themselves. Now, that is an incredibly motivated team of people to get that value of that business above £10 million. So there's lots of different ways that you can do it. It's just sort of, again, go back to understanding what it is that you want to achieve at the end. And the two founders in that business were very clear. They wanted to sell for £20 million.
Well, just to go back as well, Chris, just from an international aspect of this. So I suppose two questions that are we could maybe tag together slightly, and just to go over some points again. So we said we're doing a scheme for a hybrid organization that includes people in 5 countries. Any tips? And somebody said, what's the difference between issuing in the US and the UK? So
we'll do it in the reverse order. If you're issuing in the US, if you're issuing options in the US, you need to have a valuation called the 409A valuation, which is an American, what's the IRS? It's the American IRS requirement. So you need to do a 409A valuation every year. Now, happily, we can do that for you. There is a slight additional cost because we have to do additional work, but we can do that for you, no problem at all. If you're issuing growth shares in America, you have to do a fair market valuation, which is pretty much exactly the same as a 409A valuation. It's just called something different because it's shares rather than options. But yeah, we can do that for you. That's pretty much, America's pretty much the only place that you have to do these additional things. If you're issuing it in multi-jurisdictionals, tips I have from personal experience, keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate things for the sake of overcomplicating things. If you're going to sell your business in the next 10 years, make it an exit-only scheme. When we build something, we build it so that you can flip it from an exit-only to an exercisable after a certain amount of time. But if you're definitely going to sell in the next 10 years, just make it an exit-only, because then you don't have to deal with different share classes. You don't have to possibly change your articles of association to include things like drag and tag. It's something we do a lot. Now, it's not a problem for us. It's all digital. So I think last week I had someone who did it in the UK and then 4 European countries. There's no different, the contract doesn't change. You're just sending the actual contracts into different places. It's all inbuilt in the system.
Yeah, that's it. And I think you're right. Lots of, it might be a one-to-one that's helpful if people have got various jurisdictions, but generally, I think you're right. Lots of people that we talk to like to keep it simple. They will have an EMI scheme for those in the UK, an unapproved option scheme for those outside of the UK. They keep the criteria exactly the same, but they will face the tax of whatever jurisdiction that they're in as individuals, and they can't keep it simple so everybody's got the same thing. But there are lots of different variables that you can change. So it all comes down to what you're trying to achieve, really. Again, I suppose. And just somebody's just asked, I think they may have missed it. So a quick one just to go over. Just asked about the tax impact of growth shares when they vest. So I suppose when they've met their conditionality. So just to reiterate, there's no tax to pay at the point in which they are granted because there's no value. There's no tax to pay in which they come unconditional, because they're just now fully part of the shareholder, but they had no value at the point in which they were granted. There's only tax to pay at the point in which they are sold for that person, and then would be
20% capital gains tax.
Yeah, for the UK. Hopefully that's helped. But if you want to go through those, any others in more detail, we'll be more than happy to do so. Now, I think that's the last of the questions. Anything else you'd like to add, or any more questions from any? Fire them in quickly before we disappear. But anything you'd like to add, Chris?
I would encourage people to sort of have a consultation call. There's no commitment. It's then we can go over your use scenario.
Yeah.
And it's a case of we're here to help and try and make things simple. So I can answer your specific questions and we can go over things. If it's a 409A valuation, what does that cost, so on and so forth, or what's going to be more tax efficient in the UK, or for contractors, advisory boards. We can go through. And we've got so many people on the platform doing so many different things that I'm pretty sure that most of the questions have been answered. I hope that's not a challenge I've just set, but yeah, by all means, book in a call and we can chat everything through. The link that's on there is directly into my diary, so you can just book directly in at the best time for yourself. I think this week's pretty much booked up, but next week's probably got a bit of availability in there.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. As I say, if you do have very specific questions, do book in a call with one of the equity consultants or directly with Chris, as I've just put into the chat. We will be continuing the series. Next one along will be more around our launch, so those that have brand new companies looking to launch, and around agile partnerships. But yeah, feel free to send us any questions at a later date, or do please book in with Chris or any of the team. But thanks for joining us.